Hi, and welcome back to the Mission Minded Podcast. I'm Jim.
And I'm Mitch. It's good to be back, Jim.
Wow, we just wrapped up a great interview with Glenn Chapman.
We did. He's, got a great story. He's a pastor, right?
Yep.
Seminary professor.
Right.
Powered parachute pilot.
Yep. Say that 5 times fast. Well, maybe not.
Maybe not, yeah.
But that's the connection to ITEC.
Mm-hmm.
He was a guy working in remote villages in the Congo and using a bicycle, canoe, getting into these places, just very difficult terrain, and trying to find a new solution.
Right.
And so got connected through Steve Saint.
Yep, back in 2008, I think he said it was.
Yep. And Troy on our team was able to train him in a powered parachute.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever flown in a powered parachute, Mitch?
I have not. Although he says it's not too risky, so maybe one day I'll get up in one of those.
Yeah, and for those who might not be aware, a powered parachute is basically this small 3-wheeled rig, usually 2-seaters. Maybe they got a 1-seater. I don't know, but it's got a big propeller in the back, and the wing is the parachute.
Right.
I guess if you have an engine failure, you've already got a parachute. You're good.
Just glide back down.
Yeah. And so we actually have had some guys that have just the backpack. I think it's called a powered paramotor.
Right.
At ITEC too. Kind of different ways to approach this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Does that have any interest for you at all? I mean, maybe getting to and from work or?
I have a mild fear of flying, so
if
I can avoid not getting in the air, I will.
Okay. Well, maybe if you were having to go through some difficult terrain every day,
instead of trekking through the mud and potentially damaging equipment and things I'm bringing in, that would be a good alternative.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we get started, I want to remind everybody that we really appreciate if you were to like, to comment, to subscribe to the podcast. It helps us get the word out about these stories and try to get the message to a broader audience. So appreciate if you take the time to do that. Mitch, anything else before we get started?
I think we just jump right in. Enjoy, guys.
Welcome to Mission Minded, the podcast where we explore outside-the-box thinking in carrying out Christ's Great Commission. On this week's episode, we are joined by missionary Glenn Chapman. Our sponsor for today's podcast is Dignity Roasters Coffee. Locally roasted and packaged by the distressed to fuel each day. Dignity Roasters was born through a passion to partner with the distressed and the desire of bringing the universally loved beverage of coffee to your hands. To order your own coffee or to learn more about Dignity Roasters, visit their website at dignityroasters.com. Now here's our host, Jim Tingler and Mitch Deans.
Glenn, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
It's an honor for me to be with you.
And Glenn, you are at the tail end of your missionary journey, but can you share maybe a little bit some of the highlights of what that journey was all about? Maybe some of the places you've worked and how you were able to get there.
Okay. I think it was natural for me to fall into missions, particularly in Congo, because I'm a missionary kid. So my parents were missionaries in that same context. And my wife is actually 3rd-generation missionary in that same Congo context as well. And so going back to Congo as missionaries was pretty natural for us, but it wasn't a direct route. I mean, we took kind of a circuitous route to get there. My wife, we knew each other in high school. Our parents were both missionaries with the same organization. And I went back to college preparing for ministry because that's what people advised me to do. But it wasn't really my calling. It wasn't the calling that I had. It was a calling that other people told me that I should do. And so I started college thinking that I was preparing for missions, for ministry, But I got to doubt and to wonder, well, maybe there were other things in life besides missions. And so I went to the Army, the U.S. Army, for 6 years, and that was a real good fit for me, because the Army takes people from all different cultures and makes them into one new culture, and I felt like I had a sense of belonging in the Army. Then after about 5 years, I wondered, okay, do I stay in the military, be a chaplain, or do I get out and go into missions? One thing that the Army taught me was that my faith was something that I wanted to live for myself. It wasn't the faith of my fathers, my family, my ancestors, but it was the faith that I wanted for myself. Because prior to that, I'd been in a Christian environment all along. And with the Army, I was in a secular environment, and I could figure out who I was, myself, and what I wanted. And I wanted to be a Christian, and I wanted to serve the Lord. And the question was how I was going to serve. And while I felt like I was doing well in the Army, I felt like I could best serve the Lord by being in missions, by being in cross-cultural missions. So I got out of the Army and had the GI Bill, the old Vietnam era GI Bill, and went to seminary. And then after seminary, then I got commissioned and appointed to go back to Congo, which is where I wanted to be. That time it was Zaire, but back to Congo.
And that was with a mission organization?
Yes, that was with the International Ministries, American Baptist denomination. Their missions wing is called International Ministry.
Great.
And our organization has been in Congo since the 1880s, actually. So over 100 years in Congo.
Wow.
Yep.
And appreciate your service as well in the Army.
Thanks.
Thanks.
So
what years was that span, the 6 years that you were involved?
So I was in the Army from 78 to, I got out in 83.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then so heading back overseas, that would
So I went to seminary then for 3 years, right. 83 to 86, and then we went back out in 86, June of 86. Yeah. And I started out doing theological education by extension. So I was in the villages training lay leaders, working with the lay leaders rather than the pastoral leadership. That's kind of what I started out doing.
Yeah. And how long were you serving in the Congo for?
So we were there our first year. We were there just for a year.
Yeah.
And then we came back to the States. Then we got sent to France for language study. And then in 87, then we got sent out as official missionaries. I think that first year, 86 to 87, was a trial period. It was a year to see how we did and to see if we could fit into the missions organization. And then the language study. And then we got sent back in 87, and we mainly did evangelism and leadership training in a new area of the country that had been just recently evangelized. So raising up the laity to serve.
And was that a more remote part of the country?
Yeah, we lived in the city because we had small children. We lived in the city on a missions compound, and then I would take trips out and spend 3-4 weeks at a time out in a rural area. Did that for a few years.
Describe rural. What does rural look like in that context?
So rural would be outside of the city where there is no power, no city water, and you're living in the villages. And the infrastructure would be real poor, so you'd be getting around by bicycle or by hiking, that sort of thing.
I could imagine that would be a challenge as a missionary in those remote areas with the transportation and Were there
Yeah.
other challenges other than transportation that you faced in the field?
I think health was always a concern, but we always stayed healthy. Um, the real challenge these days in actual living now, the real challenge is living urban rather than rural. Rural things kind of stay the same and are predictable, and you know where your water source is, and you know how to get around. But in the city, things are changing all the time, and the population is increasing so fast that just getting around the city right now, the African cities are just so clogged with traffic that you can't get around at all anymore. Technology is changing pretty fast, and so the real changes are in the urban areas right now, whereas rural is pretty predictable and consistent and I don't know, peaceful right now compared to the city.
Well, Glenn, that's one of the ways that we got connected was through transportation and specifically trying to solve some problems in that world. And that goes back to Steve Saint, right?
Okay. Yeah. So I was doing evangelism in a rural context. And by this time, our family had moved out. We were out of the city. We were in a rural compound, like what used to be called a mission station, a church center. And then I'd go from there to do evangelism out along the rivers or across the roads by bicycle. And I started using audiovisual because that really drew the crowds. So I'd travel out into the villages with the Jesus film. But to show the Jesus film, then I needed a generator, I needed a projector, I needed my conductors, my VCR, my computer, and so on. And so we were trying to transport the equipment on the back of a bicycle or having people carry the stuff. And that was really hard on the equipment. And people were always eager to help carry the equipment out to the villages to project. But once you had projected to try to come back, you would never find people that were willing to carry the stuff back. They'd seen their movies, and it was hard to get people back. So it was a real challenge to transport the audiovisual equipment. So I thought about using an ultralight to get the equipment in and out of the villages. And so I went to Oshkosh Air Show to learn about ultralights. And that's where I ran into Steve Saint, who was promoting his book, The End of the Spear. And he told me about their experience in South America using a powered parachute. They were just experimenting with using powered parachutes. And so he invited me to ITEC to get training in powered parachute. And that's when, about the same time, he had met Troy. And Troy was an experienced pilot and got Troy to come to ITEC to train me. So that's how my connection started with ITEC.
So you're using bicycle, canoe, whatever whatever you can use to get into those places.
Yes.
And then you're exploring, okay, we got to find a better way to do this. This isn't working. And so you come across this powered parachute as a possibility. And if this is ITEC, probably 15 years ago or so?
This was 2008.
Okay. So the powered parachute, you got trained here in that, and were you able to take that back and use that in the remote villages?
So I came to ITEC, and Troy wasn't living in the area either. So Troy and I both arrived, and there was a machine that had been that was there at ITEC that I was able to purchase. And so Troy tested out the machine and then put me in the machine. I had my first 2 solo flights there at ITEC. And then I loaded up the machine in a U-Haul and drove clear across country because I was living in California, and caught up with some powered parachute pilots in California, and did a few more flights in California before my furlough ended, and then put the powered parachute in a container, and didn't even have to break it down, didn't even have to take it apart. It fit right in one of these shipping containers, and shipped it to Congo, and got it up to where we lived at Congo in the interior, and took it out of the container and set it up and got the rest of my experience over there.
Wow.
That's awesome.
I just wanted to clarify. So for those who might not know, Troy is on the ITEC team. At that time, he was traveling down, I believe, just to get you up to speed, right, Glenn? I think he was living in St. Louis at the time.
Yeah.
So he came down and joined the ITEC team and worked with the Maverick Project and still working with ITEC and what we now call mission transportation. And so that is trying to solve transportation issues in remote areas using tools you might not necessarily think of. And they're doing a lot of testing with UAVs now.
Yes.
And using that as a potential for transportation of small objects, and who knows where it's going to go. But just wanted to clarify for the listeners who might not. Steve Saint's one they can probably connect the dots on, but Troy, he's been around ITEC for a long time. He's our chief test pilot, all things aviation, but he did join the ITEC team and has been here now since, I think, 2009, or maybe right at 2008. So
yeah, I think I was the first person that he trained at ITEC. But the powered parachute has turned out to be just an amazing tool for evangelism, because it doesn't need special gasoline. It just uses regular gasoline, and I can take off. All I need is 100 yards to take off. So a soccer field will work, and so any decent village is going to have a soccer field. And the machine that I had then could take a pilot, and then the back seat I used for carrying my equipment. So I could put in a generator, a Honda generator, and my computer and projector and everything I needed to project, and take off right in front of my house, and then fly to these villages and land on a soccer field, and then project at night. And then when I was done, hopefully I had enough room to be able to take off on. So, you had to really watch the wind and watch your angles, and whether you're going kitty corner or sometimes sideways, all depended upon how the wind was that morning. It was pretty technical to set it all up, but an amazing machine for that context in missions.
And describe a powered parachute for those who might not have seen one before.
Okay, so a powered parachute is a cart, usually tricycle cart, that has an engine on the back with a propeller. And mine was 65 horsepower Rotax engine, kind of engine that they'd use on snowmobiles in other contexts. And then the wing is just a parachute. And so as you go forward, the parachute comes up over the cart, and then only at 26 miles an hour, really slow, you can get off the ground. So you don't need a whole lot of space to get up to a high speed. The trick was just to make sure that the parachute was deployed properly above you, and that it was stable. And then once it was stable, you go to full power and you're off the ground, traveling at a low speed, 26 miles an hour. But 26 miles an hour, across the valleys, that's all you need.
Mm-hmm. So you're basically a small little trike vehicle with a large propeller on the back, and the parachute acts as a wing. So it just, once you get going forward, it gets you enough lift and you take off.
Yeah. So you have two controls, actually. You have your power, more power and you go up, and less power you come down, and then steering. So you have ropes that are attached to the trailing edge of the parachute, and you pull on the ropes on either side, and you apply drag to the parachute. So drag to the left and you turn left, drag to the right and you turn right. So it's only really two controls. But you had to be careful when you fly. You didn't want to have too much wind. You had to make sure you're 100% sure there wasn't going to be any storm around. In a tropical context, these storms can blow up pretty quickly. So the main thing was just being aware of the weather as you were flying.
Yeah. And I'm sure, Glenn, flying in this parachute into some of the villages would have brought a crowd. Do you have any?
Oh, man. That really drew the crowds.
Yeah.
People would come from villages around. Or usually I had announced beforehand what village I was going to.
Right.
So all the villages around would come. So you really had a double header when you got to a village, because it was an air show and then a video at night. So everybody wanted to come for both the air show of the airplane landing, as well as the projecting at night. So yeah, it was an exciting time that really drew the crowds.
Yeah, and you obviously got to visit more villages than what you would have without it. Do you have some testimony that you could share, a specific story or something that really stuck out to you in your ministry, taking the Jesus film to the villages?
We use the Jesus film, which is translated into their own language. And so they could hear Jesus talking in their own language. And in Africa now, there's a kind of a movement that says that they need to get their own African messiahs, their own African prophets. But here was Jesus talking to them in their own language. And you jump from that and say, okay, Jesus came for the whole world. And he didn't just come for one particular race or one particular tribe. But here's Jesus talking to you in your own language. And people would say all the time that, these Bible stories that we had heard, that the pastors were preaching about, we got to see for ourselves. We got to really see it happen for ourselves. So it was just made a big impression on the people being able to take the Jesus film to those areas. And using the flying machine too, in the African culture, sorcerers use flight. They fly on broomsticks, interestingly. They fly in peanut shells. They have oral traditions of how the sorcerers fly, but they usually fly at night. And they usually fly for some reason that's not good for the community. It's to cause destruction. And so I could look to the people and say, I'm flying, but I'm not flying at night. I'm flying in the daylight. Everybody sees me. You all see this flying machine. And any question you have about the flying machine, I'll answer it. And you know me, and you've seen that I have come to bring good news and not bad news. Sorcerer comes to bring destruction, comes to bring disease, some malefic reason. But when I come to bring good news, and I tell you about Jesus, who is the prophet for the whole world. And I can bring you news of happiness, of peace, and not of destruction. And I'm not here secretively. I'm here for everybody to see, and everything that I say is open for everybody to hear. So it's a big difference between my going to the village in my daytime flying machine that was visible to all, compared to the sorcerers who would go at night, kind of secretively to do destruction. So that was kind of a fun way to bring the contrast between the one who brings good news and the one who brings news of destruction.
That's awesome.
Did you see yourself as a missionary pilot when you started this journey?
I'd always dreamed about being a pilot. In fact, in the military, I applied for helicopter school. I really wanted to be a pilot, but I thought that by going into missions, I would no longer have the chance of being a pilot. I thought about Mission Aviation Fellowship as well, MAF, which is a really good organization that has served us out there. I thought of being an MAF pilot, but I thought that by going to seminary, I lost my chance of becoming a pilot. But by flying PPCs, you get to be a pilot and a missionary, and a pastor at the same time. So it was an amazing experience, an amazing run to be able to do missions with a powered parachute. Steve Saint really steered me in the right direction with that, because I'd been looking at smaller ultralights, fixed wing ultralights, and he told me about the value of having a flexible wing, of having the powered parachute. And that's just ideal for our context, for our rural context, because you're under a parachute. So if you have engine trouble, the parachute's going to bring you down anyway, and you aren't going that fast. The impact isn't going to kill you. It was ideal for our context, where most of the 90% of the land is the grassland. You're only over a forest maybe 10% of the time, and over rivers. And so you just go up to a higher elevation when you go over forests and rivers, but most of the time was over the grassland. And if you have an engine out, you're going to come right down in the grass. So it felt like a safe context for flying. And we've mentioned that I've just ended my missionary career, or that chapter of missions, and I donated the machine to the National Museum in Congo, in Kinshasa. And I told them that I was a pioneer and had opened up this method of flight that they could now imitate, that they could now follow. That I prepared the way for them, and shown them that technology works for rural Africa. It's to them now to follow through with what I've started. So hopefully the young people can dream about flying as well in Congo.
That's great. How many flights did you do while you were over there? Just curious.
Well, I clocked over 500 landings.
Okay.
So a landing is different from flights to villages. Maybe a couple dozen trips to villages during the time. This last term, I didn't make trips to villages. I flew it, but I was involved so much in seminary education that I wasn't able to spend a whole lot of time feeling comfortable with the machine. To be able to fly into villages, boy, you need to be on the top of your game technically to know, to be skilled in flying, and to know your machine is in top order. And I was involved so much in teaching that I wasn't able to feel comfortable about taking the machine to villages this last 3 years. My ministry really evolved. So I started in training lay leaders, to training pastors, to seminary training, to university training pastors. So I was, this last term, I was really involved mostly with academics and administration, and wasn't able to get out in evangelism as much as I had previously. So it was like my prior years were training in evangelism, making disciples, and then in my last years it was actually raising up the leadership to be involved in leading the church.
What is the context of Christianity in the Congo, and what are the challenges, I guess, that the church is facing in the Congo currently?
Yeah. Most of the schools in Congo would be either Catholic or Protestant. Mm-hmm. So 80% of the people would claim to be Catholic or Protestant. But there's a lot of syncretism, of course. There's a lot of going back to sorcery, going back to witchcraft. And when things get tough, they would go back to witchcraft. And there's a strong movement for they call it Église de Noir, the Church of the Blacks. So it's exclusively going back to their traditional black sorcery heritage, as opposed to the Christianity that is universal. It's seeking their own heritage, but so they do things like they drink palm wine and they eat cola nuts, but it doesn't bring any positive change to the culture. It's going back to things that the ancestors did, but there was no development, there was no change back in those days. So sorcery brings destruction. It may favor individual interests, but it doesn't favor community interests, and doesn't bring about positive change that Christianity brings about. Christianity brings unity, and it builds community, and it brings solutions to the needs, like brings in hospitals and schools, and employment and development. Whereas the sorcery that they're going back to doesn't bring any positive change, just brings destruction. So that's kind of the context and other influences that are coming upon the church there in Congo.
Yeah. Well, Glenn, we greatly appreciate your service over there as well, as a missionary and teacher and serving that community. If you could go back and maybe speak into somebody who is at the beginning of their journey, and maybe even speak into your own life at the beginning of your journey, would there be something you'd like to say as an encouragement, and maybe something that you can, in hindsight, see, or maybe that you've learned that you'd like to pass on?
There's always room for missions. When we left our home at Kikongo, my wife and I were the last missionaries. After 90 years of a continuous missionary presence, we're kind of the last. And I feel like there is still room for Western missionaries in an African context. Western missionaries can provide a much needed perspective, and can provide technical training to an environment that is very low tech. And so what ITEC is doing, introducing, say, drone technology to help with medical, that's a needed technology. And I think that even as pastors, we still need in Africa Western missionaries to bring a little bit different context to missions. And so my thinking is that the day of missions is not over. Even though we're seeing a decline of Western missionaries, we still need that contact. The Congolese need to realize that they're not alone in missions, in the church, in Christianity, that there are brothers and sisters out there that care about them and can come alongside and bring support. And so I would just like to encourage a young generation that, hey, there's still the need for missions. And missions it's not focusing on one aspect. It's not just evangelism. It's not just pastoral training, but missions is holistic. It's ministering to the whole person. And so we were doing, besides training pastors, we were involved in medical work, and we were involved in agricultural work, planting lots of different fruit trees. And we were involved in the environment and helping people to realize the need for protection of the environment and management of the environment. We were involved in construction. And so for any young person out there that is kind of a jack of all trades that wants to do something that's where you're benefiting, you're helping humanity, missions is a good career choice, and you can do so many different things in missions. If I were to start over again, I don't know. I would just maintain that focus on the Lord and trying to be open to what the Lord wants to do in missions, and not necessarily what an individual wants to do, but open to the indigenous context of missions, trying to meet their needs, rather than trying to bring a missionary agenda to missions. I think the mistake that a lot of Western missionaries make is trying to bring a Western agenda to missions. But I think for us, missions has been about listening to what the Congolese need and trying to address their needs, trying to address their fears, their concerns, and to make Christianity relevant to an African context, and not transplanting an American church to Africa, but really encouraging and fostering an Africanized version of Christianity. And I think that I would hope that looking back, that's what we tried to do, is encouraging an Africanized version of Christianity and not a Western version of Christianity. So just being sensitive to the needs of those around us, rather than trying to impose a missionary agenda, I think was really important to us in ministry.
And I would assume that took a lot of time to build the relationships and the opportunity to be able to listen. It probably didn't happen right away.
Yeah, well, I had an advantage because having grown up there, I already had relationships with the people. And we were going back to friends that I had known from childhood. And so I think the more that you're with the culture, you feel their needs, and you address their needs. So in the context that Rita and I have been in this last 3 years, we haven't had other Western missionaries around us. It's just been us and the culture. Those are our colleagues that we're working with. So yeah, you live that sensitivity to the needs that are around you. You're aware much more of the suffering and of the questions that they're asking by living in a rural context with the Congolese, with the indigenous people. That was kind of our privilege. This past few years has been just being the only Westerners with the Congolese and living with them in their context.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, Glenn, we greatly appreciate the opportunity to be able to chat with you today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Hope I can get back to ITEC sometime. ITEC has been so special to our ministry of flying the powered parachute. I just appreciated so much Steve getting us together with Troy and the impact that Troy and ITEC has had on my life. And we're hoping to walk his trails just like ITEC's been involved in walking his trails.
Amen. All right. Well, thanks for joining us today, Glenn.
Yeah, thanks, Jim and Mitch. It's good to talk to you.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of Mission Minded. For more information on today's topic and show notes, please visit our website, itecusa.org. Mission Minded Podcast is produced by ITEC. The goal of this podcast is to inspire conversations about Great Commission participation. The views, organizations, and individuals represented, interviewed, and discussed on the podcast do not necessarily represent an official position or formal partnerships with ITEC.